Let's talk about open arms, and I'm really keen to hear more about veterans. The episodes that we do have where we have veterans on and sharing their experiences are very well received. So, for anyone who hasn't heard of open arms, what is it? How can it help veterans, and also how can it help their families too?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. It's a federal government department, basically, or a sub-department of the broader Department of Veterans Affairs. We operate quite separately because we're a counselling service. And for veterans who may see this, it's relevant that the way we do our work is different to the claims and compensation process that's done by DVA. We used to be called VVCS, and it was formed originally through impetus of Vietnam veterans, but now it's a service for all veterans in the broadest sense, in that anyone who's been in the military for longer than a day is eligible for our counselling services and eligible for a white card for mental health treatment. In fact, anyone who comes out of the military nowadays walks out the gate with a white card for mental health, which is really great. And it's available for partners and ex-partners up to 5 years, and children, including adult children. And so we do counselling all around Australia, individual counselling, couples counselling, family counselling. We're not a specialised service for some of those diagnosed conditions of young kids like ADHD and so forth, but we do generalised family counselling. And so the way it's framed is we've got a number of centres around Australia, in major centres. In Queensland, we've got, Brisbane, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, and Townsville. And apart from that, we engage outreach program providers, psychologists and mental health accredited social workers in private practice. So we cover pretty well everywhere in terms of availability. We've got a 24-hour assistance line, and that's where people do their intake, but they can call if they're in distress. And the other things we do is we run some groups on a variety of things: anger management, transition from the military, and a range of others. And we have a community engagement program where we engage with other service providers like RSLs and some of those newer service providers like Mates for Mates, Soldier On, and there are quite a number of those organisations out there now. And we have a peer program with lived experience veterans and family members of veterans, and they can engage with veterans, speak the language that they speak, and that's a really good program.
Yeah, lived experience is I think personally, as a lived experience therapist myself, like it's such a powerful thing to have someone on both sides of the therapy journey, both the practitioner and the client, who just kind of understand that same language and the same feelings, the same thoughts. They're never going to be the same because we all experience mental ill health or illness, or however you want to phrase it, differently. But it's so much easier when you say, I'm feeling depressed, and for that other person to know, yeah, I know what that feels like.
Yeah, and a key issue for veterans is the transition. It's the training reshapes your brain, basically, and the life in the military is different to almost any other career you can mention. It's a higher order purpose. There's a lot of meaning associated with it. And when you're in the military, it's procedurally driven. And so when one leaves the military, sometimes people feel as though they've landed on an alien planet with a whole lot of aliens in it, and particularly if they've been in for a while. And so that transition period is difficult, and that's borne out by the difficult fact that the suicide rate amongst veterans is higher than the general population in the couple of years after they leave. It's actually a touch lower or about the same when they're in the military, but it's quite a vulnerable time for veterans when they leave, because sometimes people leave the military not of their own choice. It may be a medical discharge, and so the life's dream of being in the military is shattered sometimes at initial training.
And I can imagine, like, guys, it's really hard to open up in the first place. And when we're talking about veterans, we're talking about not just guys, but women as well. But guys specifically, and I guess given this is the Mindful Men podcast, they really do struggle to come in the door and do therapy as a way of coping or improving, or even just maintenance and being well and living well. I can imagine coming into a therapy clinic in the military, like with what happens with open arms, can be very challenging. So, what does therapy look like in open arms? Is it in a clinic? You mentioned outreach. Is it in people's homes? Is it over the phone? And how do you guys break down some of those barriers for veterans coming into therapy so that they don't feel it's like an overwhelming experience?
Yeah, it's mixed with our centres and with the outreach providers. It's generally centre-based talking therapy. With the peer programs, that's an outreach program. So the peers will meet with veterans or their families outside of the office. And it can be as different as you can imagine, because the counselling that's provided mightn't be anything to do with military. It might be about childhood trauma. So we're not restricted as to what sort of things we deal with. I think it's fair to say that younger veterans are probably more, both men and women are more in tune with asking for help and in tune with their own mental health than older veterans. And so, I've dealt with veterans from World War II on, and now we've got veterans who've been for Iraq, Afghanistan. The majority of veterans have not been deployed at all. They've spent their time in Australia, but they may do disaster relief. Some of that's challenging, peacekeeping, border patrol, all those sorts of things come into our area. And quite often we're dealing with people who left the military some time ago, because with trauma, and we talk a little bit about that, it may not crop up initially, and it may crop up when someone's under stress later, or even as part of the aging process. Vietnam veterans now are in their 70s, and sometimes they've managed to keep a lid on their trauma until age sets in and your locks come off the box. And so the type of approach really depends on what issues someone brings. But yeah, we're finding with the peer program, it's a good connection to talk with veterans about what it's like, because it's a bit scary if you haven't been involved with counselling before, and particularly related to trauma. Even though trauma therapy is therapeutic, you're still revisiting stuff that you don't particularly want to visit. And the more formal exposure therapies and so forth require you to do that, to revisit and reshape your memory of events. Yeah, so it's really different depending, and couples therapy can be about managing what is a difficulty for people in the military, and that is that they'll be posted to different places every couple of years. It's hard on families, hard on partners, hard on kids, and then transition. And particularly if someone transitions and they do have diagnosed condition like depression or anxiety or PTSD, then it can be tricky on relationships.
I was going to ask how it presents with families and the moving. And so, what's some of those common themes with families that have to move around? Is it disconnection from community? Is it the lack of support? What are they talking about and worrying about?
Yeah, well, with the moving, it's like anyone who's mobile, I guess, and I've experienced it myself, that you'll be in a place for a few months or a year or whatever, and you do make friends, or try to, but then you leave. And so it's a different experience to someone who's lived in the same place all their life. And so the tendency is not to get too close to people, because you're going to move. That's one thing. Of course, with veterans who have been in combat and so forth, it's taken to another level where they may have actually lost colleagues, and that's felt by every single member. They feel really close to that. So in terms of the connection, and I suppose the difference too is, way back, families tended to live on bases, and they tend not to now. They live in the community more. Some live on base. So that veteran family community is a bit more dispersed nowadays.
I remember those hubs, because I grew up in the northern suburbs of Adelaide. So you've got Edinburgh Air Base, and I spent some time in Canberra as well. And you've got the family units and housing just near Duntroon, and it used to be quite close knit. And I guess once you move out to the community, while you might have access to the broader community, that support is very disjointed as well, I can imagine.
Yeah, it is. It is. There are services around. There's a Defence Community Organisation, which is a government department too, that connects up with families and so forth, particularly if there's issues related to moving and relocation. But yes, it's a challenge. And sometimes you'll have the veteran might move and be posted somewhere and the family remains back where they can get extended family and friend support. So you get that disconnection happening there too.
And how does that present in, I guess, relationships and keeping families together? I can imagine just by what you've briefly described there is that maybe relationships might be at a strain and break down a bit more frequently than others.
Yeah, it does put a strain on, particularly when someone's in the military takes priority. So if they say go here and go here now, that's what happens. So there's no debate over it. There is a bit more flexibility now that perhaps there used to be, trying to respond to people's individual needs, but the overall priorities of the military need to be met. So some people leave the military because of the tension between the job and family, particularly as kids are growing up. Dads or mums can miss important milestones of their kids, and then connecting with their kids, in a way which is not full time. So there's a range of challenges that apply in the military that don't necessarily apply in other jobs. And with deployments, with the more recent conflicts, they tend to be shorter but more frequent. And research is showing that the more frequent the deployments, the more issues crop up as well.
Why is that? Why would the frequency impact on our health and well-being for a veteran?
I think similar to first responders generally, particularly police, living under constant potential threat is tiring, emotionally tiring. And so the threat chemicals are sort of flowing around your body all the time, and you're never really at ease. So part of the approaches, mindful approaches that we use, will be about encouraging getting a balance back once you don't need the adrenaline and the cortisol to keep you on your toes. How you engage in more mindful activities, which are, safe, pleasant, and give you those nice well-being chemicals. And as you'd know, Simon, mindfulness is very individual too. One person's mindfulness is another person's irritation. Only got to talk about golf for that one.